Good morning, RE.THINK Church. My name is Abby, for those of you who don't know me, and I just have a few announcements for us this morning. First of all, if you're visiting with us, we would love to be able to connect with you after the service. We have an area called Guest Services out by our One Cup Cafe where you can come and get a gift just for being here. We'd love to answer any questions you may have and just get to know you a little bit better. Or you can connect digitally by texting the word HERE to 219-233-2311. There is a fun event coming up this upcoming weekend in Hobart on the 22nd. For any of you who are interested, it's a Christian-oriented family fun fall festival in Hobart, and our Annalisa and Russell are going to be leading some worship there, so bring your kids or steal some kids or just go hang out and don't steal kids, borrow, and just have a good time with them there. And then as we move into the tithes and offering portion of our service, I want to talk a little bit about one of the ministries we support here in our One Cup Cafe. For those of you who've gotten a cup of coffee out there, we keep a little donation box, but also people are able to give through our Kingdom Builders Fund online. And this supports a ministry. It's not just getting coffee. It's not just getting fair trade coffee, which is all great. But actually there's a ministry behind it too. So this partnership with Hope Coffee, they actually, it's these missionaries and these local pastors and these farmers, and they all get together to not just provide a living wage for these coffee farmers, but also to make a difference in the communities that they're in. And so one story that we heard recently was from, I believe, Honduras. And for those of you who don't know, the coffee we're drinking out there is Honduran bold, so it's coming from these farmers in this community. And so Maria, during the rainy season, she's got these kids, and to keep them safe, or to get the rain out, she would just kind of patch up with like pieces of wood or tin or whatever she could kind of scramble together. But one of the local pastors there, part of this ministry, decided to come around her family and use some of the funds that they received from this mission, this One Cup, or this coffee, that we support, and they decided to build her a roof, do something really tangible for her and her kids. And while they were there building the roof, they were able to have conversations with her about how Jesus loved her, how Jesus came for them. And when they asked her if she wanted to accept Christ as her Savior, the answer was yes, because she didn't just hear about Christ, she received his love and felt that from them. And that's all possible because of the funds that we give and the coffee that we drink to support these farmers and these missionaries over there. So I just want to thank you guys for being a part of something bigger than just our community. That's something that we strive to do here. So as you're giving to the vision and mission of RE.THINK Church, that's one of the things that's close to our heart. We want to serve Merrillville, and we are totally 100% invested in Merrillville in this community, but we're also going to be outward facing and be thinking about our brothers and sisters overseas and the work that they're doing to bring hope overseas as well. So thank you guys for that. And if you do want to give to the vision and mission of RE.THINK Church, there's two ways you can do that. We have a black box by the door if you want to give in person, or you can give online at rethinkchurch.cc. We're really glad you guys could join us this morning, and we hope you enjoyed Mark's message.
Hey, good morning. Welcome back to church. My name is Mark. I'm the pastor of our church. If you did not get some fortune cookies, raise your hand. We'll make sure you get some because you're going to need them at some point today. So, because we have 5 pounds, we might as well get some, right? So, and yeah, so there's that. So, we've been journeying through the book of Ephesians since February, and we're finally in chapter 5, and we're going to keep going, don't worry. But the reason we do this, I had emails, somebody asked me, like, hey, why do we journey through books of the Bible all the time like this? And the reason we do this is not just because it's like the tradition, like, we have to check the box off, like, we read scripture today in the church services, because, like, the early Christians went through some stuff that we should probably learn from. If you study history, by the way, if you want to make informed decisions moving forward, we have to every once in a while glance at history. That's why it's important. So you don't make the stupid mistakes, and you can actually repeat some of the good things in history, and be like, hey, yeah, that was awesome, we did this. Or you just keep repeating history, right? There's his name is St. George, and he said this, that like those who don't know history are doomed to repeat history. And so we don't want to continually repeat history in a negative way. But the early church lived through the rise and the fall of the Roman Empire. And if you look culturally speaking, America and the Roman Empire, not that America is an empire, but it is an empire, let's just face it, have very similar things going on right now. And so if the church wants to be successful, whatever that means, in this regard, like this is going to be crucial for us to learn how did our ancestors, the people who lived this out, the first or second generation of following Jesus, how did that actually happen? What does it look like? This is why we study the scriptures in that. And it's a word from God to us, in a sense. Like they're not really written directly to us, but we're reading it, we're basically reading someone else's letter. Does that make sense? And now we're going to work through this. And so we're in Ephesians chapter 5. We're in this section where Paul is now working through like these letters. He's using technology to address some issues in the city of Ephesus, the church that he planted. He's been there for a couple years. He leaves. He gets arrested. He's in Rome. He's under house arrest. And he hears of some issues. And so he's like, hey, let's use technology, which was writing a letter down at that point. Let's think about this. At some point in history, there's Greek philosophers who said that the written language is going to be the demise of human history, of human culture. Because now you're not memorizing things, you're using technology to write things down. And they would cringe at the selfies that we take, wouldn't they? Right? Like, look at this, I have a cat photo. Like, by the way, cats are sick, so you don't need to do that. But, like, look at this is how I'm using my technology. We're taking selfies, right? And so we're in this process of learning how to do this and stuff like that. And so, but he's using technology and he's writing these issues and he's saying, hey, there's some issues that are going on in this church that we need to address. You guys are divisive. You guys are in two separate groups. You have like the Jewish people, Jewish followers of Jesus, and the Gentiles followers of Jesus, and you guys are separate. The genders are separated. Let's figure out how we can bring this together. And so he addresses this, and he doesn't address it with behavior modification. He starts off by saying, hey, you have an identity. Your identity is that you've been chosen, you've been adopted, you've been called by God, by Jesus himself, because he loves you that much. And then he's giving them a calling. Like, this is how you're going to live this out. And some of you may go to other parts of this world, but most of you sit in the second to third largest city in the Roman Empire, and you're just going to love your neighbors as yourself. And this is a calling. And now he's in this part where he's going to address on how we actually walk this out. If you look at, we started this all the way back in chapter 4. Rutch is going to put this slide up to give us an understanding of this, of how we should actually walk. Now Paul's addressing how we actually live or walk this out, right? And so we're going to walk worthy. We're going to walk distinctly. We're going to walk in love. Followers of Jesus, we're going to walk as children of light. And lastly, we're going to learn how to walk wisely. And this is what we're going to talk about today and next week. Because wisely and wisdom, whatever you want to call it, man, it's a loaded thing, and we need to work through this. Paul is a Jewish rabbi who's a follower of Jesus, who's been saturated in the wisdom literature of the Hebrew Scriptures. And I don't know about you, but sometimes when I read something that's dated, I have this tendency, the American culture is very strange in this. We have this tendency to question things that are older because it's outdated. Right? American culture is one of the very few cultures that's like, hey, this new cutting edge technology, we should trust it, right? We like, beta's awesome, right? Like that's how we approach everything. Where every other culture in the world is like, actually, it's new. Let's challenge it. Let's test it. Let's question everything that's there. And so what we have to learn how do we live in America with this mindset and walk wisely. We in America love to grasp at the youth, don't we? We spend $2.15 billion on Botox so that we can keep looking younger. And we've all seen the bad Botox, haven't we? It's awesome. I won't put any pictures up here because I don't want to embarrass people, but when I see it, I just laugh, right? Where these people who don't know how to age gracefully are reaching back, trying to be more, whatever the hip trendy version of this is, and then they screw it all up, right? We hate the idea of gray hair. We hate the idea of baldness, right? I can say that from like whatever, you know? It's what I'm here for, right? Like I'll just rock it with you. So what we do is I get a stupid email every week about how like there's gray in your beard. Here's this product that can help you out with that. I don't care about that. I want a white beard as much as I can get, right? I will be your Santa Claus at some point. So there's that. But the reality of it is here in America, we grasp at trying to like attain the youth and just keep it. Where the rest of the world has learned how to age gracefully. And so, because of this, we think that we're always finding new technology. For example, in 2016, I was reading this journal, this biblical archaeological journal, because that's what I do. And so, somewhere in the Middle East, they're looking through Babylonian text, and they found all these artifacts. And the numbers and the math that was there, they had to bring in translations, they had to bring in mathematicians, and they're like, what are we actually looking at? And what they noticed is that they were studying the patterns of the stars, the movement of the stars. But they're using advanced calculus that had been buried for 3,000 years. And at the same time, Oxford mathematicians are using this form of calculus, thinking they discovered something, they're going to write their own doctorate, like their doctoral material on it. And then all of a sudden in the education world, they started talking, they're like, actually, you haven't discovered anything new, this has been buried for 3,000 years. But the Oxford mathematicians are like, we're so smart, look what we discovered. And the archaeologists are like, no, you didn't discover that. They did this 3,000 years ago without calculators. Right? Like think about like all the advances that we see. So we tend to think we're great at certain things, but wisdom and knowledge are not the same thing. We've talked about this before. Just because you have information doesn't mean you actually know how to do it. One of our sons was trying to figure out how to fix something on his car. And Carson doesn't have a car, so you can figure out what son that is without naming it. But he's constantly saying, well, I found it on YouTube. And I'm like, great. Is anyone going to help you? Like, look over your shoulder, make sure you can screw this whole thing up. Just because you have YouTube doesn't mean that you have the actual ability or the knowledge or the wisdom to actually engage in that. So information and all that is not the same thing. Information is kind of like when you get to geographic north compared to true north. Geographic north and true north are not the same thing. They're about 500 kilometers apart. So you can get you close, but you're not really there. The wisdom literature that Paul would have been saturated in and applying all of this gets you to true north. Just because you have the information doesn't mean it's necessarily there. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to spend a few weeks just unpacking what the wisdom literature really is and how to apply it, how to actually start working this out. There's two schools of thought of how many wisdom literature books there are. One group of rabbis in the Hebrew Scriptures say 3, another group of rabbis say 4. And I'm going to give you the books, and you can decide. Everyone agrees that Proverbs, Job, and Ecclesiastes are biblical literature. The group that think that 4 is the Songs of Solomon book. Because it's going to take wisdom and how to engage in a marriage relationship. And all the married people are like, yep, I see that's wisdom. And all the swinging, are like, let's just leave it there. So, but the way that I've had to approach this, because I questioned, when I read that about Job, I was like, I don't know if Job's really wisdom. I don't know about Ecclesiastes, I don't know about that. But this analogy has really helped me out. And to think that, let's say you walk into a bar, and you have a question. And there's 3, maybe 4 stools at the bar. And the first lady that you're going to see is kind of like the book of Proverbs. The young lady is deep in knowledge, has information, has the ability to rattle off questions, like answers to your questions and stuff like that, can know tons and tons of things about mathematicians and about work ethic and about how to deal with stuff. And she's just so smart. She's young. She's optimistic. She's like, if you follow this pattern, that's how it's going to work. And then in the middle, there's this guy who's a middle-aged, cynical man who's been like, yeah, that works sometimes, but not all the time. It's kind of like meaningless things, right? Like they're cynical, they just have the ability to just kind of like, this person has the ability to just kind of undercut, like, yeah, it should work like that, but it doesn't always, right? And then there's this old man, Job, who sits off to the corner, doesn't say a ton, and you can tell he's been through a lot. And he's been with God in the heights, amazing times. He's been with God at the very lowest points of his life. And he doesn't say a ton, but when he does speak, you should listen. Yeah. And this is kind of what it's like when you come to a question of the biblical literature to me, because I can find an answer very quickly in Proverbs, but then there's this questioning ability and like the cynical version of middle-aged man that's there, and then the wisdom of Job that's just like, man, how do you deal with all this? Yeah. So today, here's what we're going to do. How do we actually navigate through the book of Proverbs? And then next week we'll tackle Ecclesiastes and Job. Because here's what we found. When you look at all of the biblical literature, here's what it invites you to do. It invites you to wrestle through complexities and the struggles and the painful parts of life. When Paul says, walk wisely, he's not saying make sure you have enough good, quick answers that just kind of rattle off when somebody asks you a question. He's saying have the depth of knowledge, experience, and the wisdom that's there. Because here's the deal, life is complex. You can do all the right things and crap will still happen to you. You can do all the bad things and somehow that person is going to be like what we call a blessed life. You know what I mean? Like all the parking spots are going to open up in the mall and all the things are just like somehow they can scheme the systems and they never get caught. Like that, how do you deal with all of that stuff? How do you approach life when you just see all these different realities of life? And here's the deal. We don't start off at the same level playing field. We don't. So how do we deal with this? And then, here's the other part. This is the painful part for me to realize. My own stupidity has put me in a place where I've needed wisdom to get out of that place. Does that make sense? Yeah. And like, yeah, Jesus forgives me of my sins, but how do I actually pay that debt off that I wanted because I wanted whatever I wanted? You know what I mean? Like, how do we actually work that out? How do we say, okay, well, my own stupidity got me here, so how do I actually apply wisdom in all this? And so here's what we're going to do. We're just going to read through parts of the Bible, now parts of Proverbs. And so if you have your Bible, like in Proverbs or whatever, you can do this. The very opening passages in Proverbs are kind of like reading the back part of a book in our own culture. We're going to have the summary, kind of like gives you a glimpse of it all, and then you get to go from there. So here's the opening pages, or the opening verses of Proverbs. The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. Now let's pause here. And this is why it takes forever to get through books. But when you look at the Proverbs of Solomon, or the book of Proverbs, sorry, it's not all Solomon. Here's what I think actually happened. They wrote down, like Solomon wrote all of his Proverbs down, and then eventually some other scholars, the Hebrew scholars, are like, oh yeah, but here's this other king, you'll see it in chapter 30. Here's this other king, we don't know who he is, like, but he's not the king of Solomon or Israel, he's a different king, but he has wise things to say too. And then you have the other unknown authors. And so I think they just like, let's collect them all. And Proverbs is mainly written by Solomon, not 100% written by Solomon. Does that make sense? Yeah. So when you see this, they're not contradicting themselves, they're complementing each other. Does that make sense? It's more of a collected items and stuff like that. So verse 2, or whatever you call this, for learning wisdom and discipline, for understanding insightful sayings, for receiving prudent instruction in righteousness, justice, and integrity. Your version, your translation may say for what is right, just, and fair, but it's the same thing. For teaching shrewdness to the inexperience and knowledge to the discernment to a young man, and let the wise person listen and increasing learning. Let the discerning person obtain guidance in understanding a proverb or parable with the words of the wise and their riddles. Now, part of what we have to understand is the book of Proverbs are a bunch of proverbs. This sounds very basic. But a proverb is one short statement that compares one thing to another thing. It's not a promise. How many of you guys have ever approached the book of Proverbs like it's a promise? God said it, I'm going to believe it, there it is. If I follow this, God has to bless me. I'm going to name it, I'm going to claim it, that I'm owed this. Like it's a 3-step formula. If you're a gambler, which I'm not really a gambler, here's what I've understood. The book of Proverbs helps you increase your odds. That if you do this, it helps you increase your odds. It's kind of like reading a bunch of fortune cookies, right? So, you don't read fortune cookies like they're a book, right? Like, you don't go to a grocery store and ask for a 5-pound bag of fortune cookies, do you? This is what happened to me last night. I went in to the 5-star over on 30, and I was like, hey, do you guys have fortune cookies? Like, I can get like 100 of them? And they're like, well, here's 5 pounds of them. And I was like, deal. Why not? So, if you have your fortune cookies, grab them out, open them up. These are fancy, these are QR codes. So, and if I don't care if you eat them, they're there for you. But, here's what I want you to do. Take a moment, read over the ones that you have, and then share them with somebody near you. What does your fortune cookie say, okay?
You deserve it financially, so I thought this wasn't the 14th.
Find someone who's hard for you. Okay.
It seems to be.
All right. Now, is anyone going to plan on piecing all these together and writing these as a novel that you're going to read from page 1 to the end of whatever this page would be? Not really, right? And yet, when we approach Proverbs, it's kind of what we do. Because we read books from page 1 to whatever the last page is. In fact, there's like, and I practice this. There's 31 chapters in the book of Proverbs, 31 days in most months. Read a chapter a day, and you'll be wiser. Well, you'll have more information. How about that? You know what I mean? So, when it comes to Proverbs, you have to remember, these are just these small little statements, right? This is like these one-liners, and we're going to work through them because it just gives a good understanding for this. And so, that's part of this process is looking at this. Now, one of my favorite ones is the Proverbs chapter 26, verse 17. And it's these things of like taking one or two things, comparing them to each other, and then drawing a conclusion. What it doesn't tell you to do is give you the answer. Does that make sense? So let's look at the first one. Verse 26, or chapter 26, verse 17. Like one who grabs a stray dog by its ears is someone who rushes into a quarrel, not of their own. Anyone ever meddle stuff you should just kept out of? Now, what he doesn't say is don't do it. What he's saying is, if something happens to you, don't be surprised when you got into some of the stuff that you shouldn't have been into. Yeah. Anyone ever grabbed a dog and it's bitten you because you grabbed the dog by its ears? And like, that's what he's saying here. Don't be surprised when you grab a dog by its ears and it bites you. My father-in-law says this, keep your nose on your own plate. And a lot of the world's issues could go away if we kept our nose on our own plate. And at the same time, a lot of things would be overlooked and ignored if people didn't keep their nose on their own plate. We need advocacy. We need people to stand up for other people. We need to find people who are being overlooked and oppressed and all this other stuff. But here's the deal. What Proverbs is saying is, don't be surprised when you have some pushback. Approach it with wisdom, saying, oh, if I do this, some people are going to resist this. Because when you challenge the status quo, whatever the status quo is, there's going to push back on you. Right? Does that mean you don't do it? No, it means you get in, like you go into it knowing what could possibly happen. Right? When you call people out on their issues, some people don't necessarily love that. You just need to be aware of it. Like some of us would read this and be like, well, I'm not getting involved in other people's stuff. And that could be your approach, but that also just means you live in a nice little bubble, right? As the world progresses around you. So here's the next one that I have for us. Is Proverbs chapter 14, verse 4. I'll just read it to you because that's a whole lot easier. So here we go. Where there are no oxen, the manger or the stable is empty. But from there, the strength of the ox comes from the abundant harvest. The harvest comes from the strength of the ox. So here's what he's saying. If you want to have a clean little stable, we have garages now. We don't have, unless you do have a stable, and let's talk. But if you have a stable, you can either have a clean one or you can have an oxen in it. If you have an oxen, you have a larger harvest. If you don't, you're going to have a small harvest. So if you want to have a blessing, there's going to be this reality that if you want to have productivity, you're going to have some messy parts of your life. You really can't really have both. You have to deal with some kind of part of your life is going to be unkept. Does that make sense? Some part of your life is just going to look like a mess. Who has a junk drawer? Who has a junk room? Who has a junk floor? Let's go with that, right? Some of us, we just do. We have a relative that's literally, they have 2 spare bedrooms and it's just full of stuff. And the spouses won't tell each other what's in their stuff. You know what I mean? They're both of them would be if so-and-so knew this, we'd be in so much trouble. And they just keep moving stuff around to keep it out of there. But here's the deal. We all have certain things that are if we had to have this productivity, we're there. You know what I mean? So if you're going to have high productivity, if you're going to be able to work 60 hours a week, stuff like that, parts of your life is just going to kind of fall apart. You need to be aware of that. That's part of that process. It's not always going to be everything nice and tidy. That's part of this process. And here's the deal. You need to know which one you want. Because there's going to be times in your life when you want simple, easy to maintain. There's also going to be times in your life where you need high productivity, insane hours, high returns on investment, all that kind of stuff. And how do you deal with this? How do you know which is which? How do you know which one to deal with? Well, it takes wisdom. You can't just hope for it. You just have to process this out. In Proverbs chapter 8, there's this beautiful poem. I'm going to encourage you to read it. And it talks about that this power of wisdom. In the Hebrew language, it's called hokmah. And I'm not going to say it correctly because I don't feel like coughing on you. But it's hokmah, basically. And it talks about how God used wisdom to create this earth. And hokmah, this wisdom power, is just part of the universe system that he created. And he wasn't just I think this should be a mountain. He wisely chose where mountains should be. He wisely chose where the rivers should be. He wisely chose that you should be born where you were born, to live in this time and day and this age. For some reason. And he wisely chose, here's where the water stops, here's where the land starts. He wisely chose, I'm going to separate this atmosphere, the waters and all this, and create this nice little atmosphere. And he wisely put earth hanging at a certain angle so that we don't burn up and we don't freeze. He used wisdom to create his earth. And here's what it says at the very end of that. Proverbs chapter 8, verse 32. If I can find that real quick. There we go. Now then, my children, listen to me. Blessed are those who keep my ways. What does that mean? When you sit down to structure your week, because you'll have 167 hours outside of this 1 hour, how are you going to structure this? And you will be blessed if you use the same wisdom to structure your week that God used to structure the earth and the creation. If you just let your hours take over, they will take over. You will allow, if some of you have jobs like this, where if you wanted to work 80 hours a week, your boss would not complain. But let's go back to chapter 14, verse 4. How wise is that? Or are you just going to let the foolishness of this world run right over you? And when we do that, here's what happens. Our health struggles, our families will struggle. How many of us have ever seen a successful business person, but their family life is completely crap and trash? Right? How many of us have ever seen the person who has shrewd business skills, amazing business skills, can negotiate himself out of anything, right? Could You could sell anything to anyone, but all of a sudden, the way you did that was through manipulation. Right? That matters. How we actually handle things matter. And what God is saying here in Proverbs chapter 8 is use wisdom to get what you need to get done. Don't allow the hours just to run right over you. Use wisdom to structure your hours and say, okay, I'm going to give my job 40 hours, 44 hours, whatever it is. I'm going to work out for X amount of hours. I'm going to sleep X amount of hours. I'm going to rest and relax X amount of hours. And if you do this, you'll be blessed. Does that mean that nothing wrong is ever going to happen to you? No. But it does mean you're going to tell your hours what to do, not your hours telling you what to do. You can structure this out, and it's going to take wisdom to do that. And here's the other part of this. Let's go back to the beginning part of this, where most of us in America, we try to attain the youth. We try to hold on to that as much as we possibly can. We have wise business people who've been through what you've been through. One of my favorite parts about our church is the diversity here. That we have people who are in their retirement age or approaching retirement age. And we have people who are starting out in their careers. Talk to each other. You don't need my permission. Here's my permission. Go talk to each other. How about that? Right there. Wave my magic wand and gave them all permission with the fairy dust. All right? Do it. And so, what you'll learn is some people have already been through this. Some people are going to be going through this. How do you engage this? How do you navigate through these things? Some of us who've been through recessions before, we're like, yeah, we've seen this before. Here's how we navigate through this. You know what I mean? So we know how to get through these things. But the other thing about this is, how many of us have ever seen an 80-year-old who acts like a 14-year-old? Or a 45-year-old who acts like a 10-year-old? Because we get older doesn't mean we mature. And also, we have this new tendency where these people are coming out of like 23, 24 years old, and they are trying to attain the status of people who've taken decades to get to. They want to live in that neighborhood, they want to drive these certain cars, and they're doing certain things that can happen, that they can attain it, but they're not doing it wisely. So they rack up debt, they rack up the pressure, they rack up the stress, and all that, and they're just living their hours just overwhelm them, and they have no peace at home. Here's the deal. When you're 40, act like you're 40. If you're 24, act like you're 24. Right? And as we get older, let's just mature with it. And how does that happen? By using wisdom. Chapter 1, verse 7 gives us a clue on how that actually happened. It says this: the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. What does it mean to fear the Lord? Should we be afraid of God? Should we not be afraid of God? What does that look like? There are commentaries out the wazoo about what does that actually mean. These three words, fear the Lord, is this crucial amount of ability. But here's what I've come to understand, is that it's going to take wisdom to know how to do this. And where we start this is understanding our role in this universe. Knowing that God is God, we're not, and we can trust Him. He's a trustworthy God, and all of that. And so, when it comes down to it, we have to start applying what this fear of the Lord really looks like. And when things happen to us, God is not necessarily out to get you. There may be a lesson involved in that. We live in a world that He created, and He created it good. But because the humans have unleashed evil, stupid things happen to us.
Yeah.
Some of us deal with the sins and the evil of other people. Some of us, because we've dealt with our own issues. But it's going to take wisdom on how to navigate through this. And I'm just going to say this. We can approach the Bible and just read the Bible and take it for what it is. But then what do you do when the Bible seems to contradict itself? Here's an example. Proverbs chapter 26, verse 4. Let's read it here real quickly. Don't answer a fool according to his folly, or you yourself will be just like him. Pretty straightforward, right? Let's go to the very next verse. Answer a fool according to his folly. Am I not supposed to answer the fool? Am I supposed to answer the fool? What am I doing here, right? Or in his own eyes, he will be wise in his own eyes, right? So, once again, most of us, we approach the biblical literature thinking we can just read it for what it is. Well, would you read two different statements like fortune cookies and expect them to be the same kind of thing? Not really. They're going to be there, they're going to be like, and it's going to take wisdom to do this. And you have to know which one is, which time to apply it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's not just this blanket statement of like, just do it. Just do what the Bible says. It's going to take wisdom to practice this. And it's kind of like when you start practicing certain things and you attain that ability to practice it, and you practice it more, and you kind of level up. Does that make sense? And you're in this version of it. The more you apply it, the better off you'll be. There's an account in the Kings about Elisha and this widow. And this widow needs so much debt to pay off. And Elisha says, okay, go gather all the jars that you can from your neighbors and all this, and pour the oil out of this one jar. And as soon as all the jars are filled, then you can sell them, right? And as soon as the last jar that they collected was filled, they're like, is there any, the lady goes, is there any other jars for her son? And he was like, no. That's when the oil stopped. It's this miracle that took place, and it's just a beautiful image of this, that the outpouring will happen as long as there's vessels to be poured into. And that's kind of like what wisdom is. The more you use it, the more to be filled into and all that. And it's this beautiful thing of like, when we start applying wisdom, God gives us a little bit more along the way. And we just keep practicing this. These proverbs are not going to be a 3-step formula for success. They're going to better your odds, right? And I just want to read Proverbs chapter 1, verse 20 to us. There's something beautiful about this. Wisdom calls out. Hope calls out in the streets. And she makes her voice heard in the city gates. Wisdom is this female attribute of God. And we can get into the nuancing there. But this beautiful reality of it, when Solomon would have wrote that wisdom calls out from the city gates, this was countercultural in every degree. Only the elders who were men sat at the city gates, deciding the affairs of the city and that culture. And Solomon says, no. We need all of this. We need wisdom. We need the females to be involved in this whole process. We've talked about this before, that in the creation account, that the culmination of creation is the female. Is like God creates humans out of their own image, and then he recognizes at some point, oh, it's not good. The human, or Adam, is in the Hebrew, was alone, and there wasn't a suitable helpmate. So for whatever reason, he puts Adam to sleep, and then creates Adam out of his rib, meaning side by side, not out of his foot to be ruled over, not of his head to be part of the head of it, but side by side. And this is this beautiful version of this, that when it comes to wisdom, to understand that what the full amount of wisdom is, it takes all of us. And you can learn from anyone. So if you think that you're smarter and more superior than other people, I think God has other things for you. And this is what it really looks like for us to lead into this wisdom of how to apply it. I tell my students all the time, and if you're in education, you know this too, that sometimes you learn from your students in shocking ways, and it's okay. If you walk into any room thinking you're the smartest person in that room, I hope at some point you're humbled. Not in a horrible way, but at least at some point, right? Don't continually walk around thinking you're the smartest person in there, because God has something for us to learn from anyone. And here's the deal: any human that you've ever seen is an image bearer of God himself. No matter what skin color, gender, or anything like that. So treat each other like that. And as we do this, let's learn wisdom from this. And the lady in the bar, man, she is optimistic. She's full of answers. And she's thinking, man, if you just follow this, it's going to be awesome. But next week, we're going to learn from the cynic and the old man who's been through it all. All right? Let's pray. God, thanks for this day. Thanks for who you are. Jesus, thank you that you were the prime example of what does it look like to live in the fear of the Lord. That you shunned evil. That you trusted the Father. That you did nothing without consulting the Father first. Because you feared the Lord. And because of that, you were wise beyond people's understanding. And my prayer for us today is that we would fear you, Lord, and that we would walk around and just seek you and where you're moving. And when life happens to us, we wouldn't just respond, that we would wisely pause and consider our options, and that we would trust the relationship with Holy Spirit to walk wisely. We love you, Jesus. Genuinely pray this. Amen. Well, if you need prayer for anything, I'd love to meet you in the back. If you're new with us, love to see you at guest services. Abby will be out there as well to connect with you. And church, I hope you know this to be true, that God loves you, and I love you, and as we follow him, we'll count him the best house in all for. So let's go and be in the church. Have a great week. See you next Sunday.